Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give it a few seconds to let everyone join our call tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a lot of people signed up tonight. So like I said, I'm just going to give it about 30 more seconds to let people jump on. Hi, everyone. Again, just giving it a few more seconds. I see some folks still jumping on tonight. Thank you again for joining us. We'll get started in just a second. And I already see some folks introducing themselves in the chat. Yes, definitely do so. We're definitely encouraging that tonight. Okay, well, good evening, everyone, again, and welcome to See Yourself Running, the realities of running as a Black candidate. My name is Candace Harris. I'm the Midwestern Regional Director here at Run for Something. One of the most rewarding aspects of my job is to recruit and support amazing Black candidates to run strong grassroots elections. I know that there are many amazing future candidates on this call, so it is my pleasure to be your host and moderator for tonight's event. So a few housekeeping items as we get started. I see a few of y'all are already modeling. We're encouraging everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box. Make sure that your settings are changed to everyone and not just host and panelists. Make sure it says everyone in that little blue box in the chat so everyone can see what you're saying. Feel free to share your name, where you're from, and what brought you to the call this evening. And also feel free to comment on the program or interact with other attendees throughout the program. This is a great chance to get to know each other and to help build community. After some initial discussion with our panelists, we will open up the floor for questions. So please put any questions you have for the panel in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. That's where we're going to be pulling questions from. So again, please put them there. We're not going to be able to pull questions from the chat because as you can see, there's a lot of activity there going on already. And also for this webinar, we are using the Zoom live transcription services. If you would like to view live captions on your screen, please click the More menu in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom menu and select Show Subtitle. Later during the call, we will also launch a poll. So if you would like to take the next step in working with Run for Something, you'll be able to opt in to do so. So let's get started with our program. So Black History Month this year is special for so many reasons. Our world has really shifted over the last few years to one where terms like intersectionality and diversity, equity, inclusion are mainstream topics of conversation. Our movements for social justice and liberation are taking a forefront in politics, and our voices are more powerful than ever. But there is still a universal truth that being Black and running for office will present hurdles, challenges, and opportunities that require attention and support from political infrastructures and institutions that go beyond the basics. And this is not a new issue. Black candidates are often tasked with the complicated nuances of running while Black. In the 5 years Run for Something has been supporting young progressive candidates around the nation, we've heard from hundreds of Black candidates about their experiences. We've heard people say things like, worrying about canvassing and worrying if their neighbors might call the police on them while they're just trying to get out the vote because they see a Black person walking up to their door and they're unfamiliar with them. Or they tell us things about not getting support from the state and local parties in the same way that they feel like they need to as other candidates are getting. Or even having to address systemic and persistent racism as a potential elected official, while also living under those same constraints of those racist institutions. Because if we don't address those issues in our community head on, then who will? Run for Something has set out to challenge ourselves to do better and be better and show up for our dynamic Black candidates and potential candidates in actions and words. It's not enough to say, hey, run for office. We're saying that we've got you. Tonight's call is a place for us to come together as a political community invested in Black candidates from all walks of life to provide honest advice, answer questions, and create a community of support that you need when you're stepping up to run for office. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to take a moment to review what Run for Something is all about. So we encourage young, diverse progressives to run for local and state office. More specifically, Run for Something endorses diverse progressive candidates who are aged 40 and under, running for the first, second, or third time, and running for down ballot offices. So that's everything from city council, mayor, county commission, state legislature, school board, county clerk, sheriff, park district commissioner, district attorney, and so on. Since Run for Something started in 2017, we have identified more than 100,000 young people who want to run for office. We've endorsed over 1,900 all-star candidates in all 50 states and DC. To date, Run for Something has elected more than 630 candidates to state and local office in 48 states. Our winners are 57% women, 58% people of color, and 21% LGBTQIA+. And to be more specific, to date, we have endorsed 475 Black candidates, and 179 of them have ran and won their races and are in elected office right now. And we're looking to endorse many more in the years to come. We also provide coaching for our endorsed candidates to support you through every phase of your campaign. We provide resources, trainings, and connect candidates with partners who can help your campaigns. We also work with our alumni to support current candidates and to make connections that will help you all govern successfully once elected. We do this because we know that more young, diverse, and exciting progressives running strong grassroots campaigns across the country will increase immediate turnout for Democrats up and down the ticket and help build political power for underrepresented groups across the country. And it will also change the conversation about who is electable in this country. At Run for Something, we focus on these local races because the local elected leaders directly influence people's everyday lives. So we truly hope this call will either help you in your run or convince you to consider running in your community. Okay, with that said, let's introduce our panel of Run for Something candidates tonight. Tonight, we're thrilled to have a conversation with J.B. Smiley Jr., who is currently elected to the Memphis, Tennessee City Council in 2019, and now in 2022 is a candidate for governor of Tennessee. Thank you for joining us, JB. We also have Alicia D. Smith on the call tonight, who was elected to the Minneapolis Park Commission in 2021. And we're also pleased to be joined by Dave Halbert, who was a candidate for Boston City Council at large in 2021. Okay, panelists. So for our first question, which I will pose to JB first, please introduce yourself a little bit more and also tell us, why did you decide to run for office?
Good evening, everyone. First, thank you to Run for Something for giving me an opportunity to just share a few words with you all. Like she said, I'm J.B. Smiley Jr., native Memphian, lifelong Tennessean, lawyer by trade. I came up and, never thought about anything dealing with politics. For me, it was basketball and community. At some point, I decided to go to law school, and then learning about the law and the injustices that were facing the community that I live in Memphis, Tennessee, I always tried to figure out a way to do something more. And let me just fast forward and tell you how I decided to make the decision to run for office. So at one particular time, a friend of mine decided to pull me along and say, there's an organization called the Shelby County Young Democrats. I have the media, I have the marketing, I have the strategy, but you can get the people. So would you join the ticket? I said, sure. Ended up part of the organization. We won the election for Shelby County Young Democrats. And then the more I learned about the community, the more I learned about the area in which I grew up in, I was trying to figure out ways that I can impact it. And more specifically, the neighborhood in which that I spent summers of my childhood was the poor zip code in the state of Tennessee. And a lot of my colleagues were telling me I was positioned to run. and they encouraged me to go have a conversation with someone else who was seeking the particular office that I was looking at. And to make a long story short, had a conversation with the gentleman, and at this point I was extremely idealistic. And essentially what he told me is that he was seeking the office because he could win. It wasn't anything about making the community better. It wasn't anything about, raising the floor for marginalized communities. It wasn't anything about investing in a community that needs investment. It was about whether he thought he could win, whether the fact that his dad was a former mayor. And in my perspective, I think communities deserve folks who are willing to advocate on their behalf. And to make a long story short, we ended up getting in that race. It ran really hard, and that's essentially how we got started. We worked extremely hard to win a race, and I was only home for 6 months at a time, and from that point we just moved it. We ended up finishing second in that race, and from that point on, everyone was talking about the young guy who recently moved home that had a message that really resonated in the community that I grew up in. We've been running really hard ever since, and I think a few months, 6 months later, we ended up running to serve on the Memphis City Council for a super district in the city of Memphis. Is about 325,000 people, and we were successful.
Thanks so much, JB. Alicia, could you please introduce yourself as well, and also tell us, why did you decide to run for office?
So good evening, everyone. Alicia D. Smith here, and from Minneapolis. And many people who have maybe never heard of Minneapolis before all now know Minneapolis because of the infamous lynching of George Perry Floyd Jr. by the Minneapolis Police Department just here summer of 2020, and subsequently since then continuing to lynch Black men like every couple months here to stay relevant in the news. But I decided to run for Parks here in Minneapolis as a mother with two young sons, and the Parks being a place that we frequent every single day. I saw some inequities in some of the inner city parks with some of the young people that I work with as an executive. I was the executive director of a YMCA here, currently an executive director of a neighborhood organization. And what I saw was inequities across our city between our northern part of our city and the southern part of our city. And many of the kids that I would serve and that my children were friends with, there was a gap in accessibility in the quality of programming. And because that was something that's really close and near and dear to my heart, and I get to fight about every day, I decided to throw my hat in the ring for park commissioner here in the city. And subsequently I won, and now I am the only Black woman and the only person of color on this board that is in charge of the largest landholder in the state of Minnesota here in the city of Minneapolis, and working to bring about changes in not only the quality of program, but in the facilities. And so that these inequities from one part of our city to another part of our city no longer exist. And that means reinvesting where there have been disinvestment in local parks and programming and staff, in particular staff of color that look like the children in the neighborhoods in which we serve, to make sure that we get those quality of programs up to meet the level that is desired by the neighborhoods, but also that we get the input from the neighbors to make sure that it's programming that they actually desire. And so in doing so, as a park board commissioner, in addition to being elected, I was appointed the vice president of the park board. And so that gives me a unique opportunity to influence from the inside out and bring along community with me. And I tell people all the time that I am the community commissioner who is elected. And so I get to bring folks who have never been invited to sit at the table. I get to bring the whole community with me on any given Sunday or Monday. You just pick and choose, and we can really bring our issues forward and be heard. And so that's a little bit about me. I have a BA in legal studies, I have a master's of art in organizational leadership, and all of my work experience for the last 15 years has been in executive leadership and developing other people to do great things. And I've had the great fortune of developing a really diverse staff and bringing lots of young people like myself along and elevating us into leadership positions where oftentimes it sucks that we're the only one, but breaking that mold to say we will no longer be the only. So when you're the only, your obligation is to bring someone else in the room with you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And David, please introduce yourself and also tell us, why did you decide to run for office?
Great. Thank you so much, Candace. I really appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. My name is David Halbert. I'm speaking to you here from my lovely basement in Boston, Massachusetts. You might wonder why, if I'm coming from Boston, don't I have anything close to a Boston accent? And that's because originally I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, but I moved to Massachusetts when I was a kid. And the pathway that led me towards running is really the biography of my life, which is around public service. I'm the son of 2 career federal employees. My mother worked for 26 years at the US EPA. My father worked for the Veterans Administration and the Department of Justice and lives down in Atlanta. My mother's still up this way, thankfully, because I'm also a proud father of 2 little girls. So a lot of times, thankfully, she takes them. That is one of the reasons I was able to run in the first place, having that kind of infrastructure and support. And I'm sure we'll get to that later on this evening. But for me, my career has really always been about public service. So I had the privilege of serving at our state house as a legislative aide and working for Governor Deval Patrick, only the 2nd Black governor in United States history, which was one of the privileges and highlights of my life professionally. And then after that, I went and worked on the Boston City Council as a staffer there and really got to see municipal government up close and personal, seeing not just what you see on our paper here, the Boston Globe, every day above the fold, but really that kind of work that you're doing. Because as they say, municipal government is the government that's closest to people. It's the government that takes care of your parks, or that picks up your trash, or that when there's an issue with police, which we know is something that many of us have dealt with, unfortunately, and so many of our friends and neighbors and family deal with as well, that's really who you call. And so that inspired me. And actually in 2019, I made my first run for office. In Massachusetts, it's a little bit tough. I was working as an official for a public agency. And so that kind of handcuffed me a little bit. I was able to make it through to the final round of our election that year, but unfortunately didn't make it on the council. And in 2021 was encouraged by a number of friends here in the area, folks who got to know me through that race and thought that I had something to bring to the table. So I ran again, and it was a hard fought race. It was one of the most competitive that the city's seen. We had 17 people running for our 4 at-large seats, 2 incumbents and 15 other individuals like myself who were not on the council at that time. Made it through to the final round once again and came up just short, coming in 5th out of all 17 candidates in total. So I missed it by 311 votes. But you learn, right? Through your successes and through those areas where maybe you fall a little bit short, you take those lessons and you also realize why you're doing this. And for me, it was never about having a title or seeing my name in a newspaper or anything like that. It was always about trying to find the greatest platform where I could elevate my ability to help and to serve others. And so what I've taken since an election day is just looking for new pathways. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that I was recently named as executive director of the Progressive Funders of Massachusetts Collaborative. It's a statewide voting table seeking to support progressive candidates all across Massachusetts, which I know for people outside the state, they're like, what do you need? Of course, Massachusetts, the bluest state in the country, but blue doesn't mean progressive. And so that's the work that we're doing. But as part of that, it's taking that story of some of the challenges and difficulties that I faced as a candidate of color that so many others have faced here locally, and as we'll discuss later this evening, nationally, and taking that to those individuals who have those deeper pockets and need to fund candidates who are in office who are making changes like Alicia and like JB. So I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation, and thank you to Run for Something.
Thank you all so much. So JB, this next question is for you. Before you ran for office, what community groups were you involved with? How did leadership roles help you in your campaign for city council?
Okay, so for me, I think I mentioned previously the Shelby County Young Democrats. I think it was instrumental in my campaign because those are the people that I relied on throughout the campaigning process. But also, one of the things I realized is when you're seeking public office, the community is not going to be made up of only the people that are in your age group. So it's not going to be all millennials. When you go out in the community, it's going to be older people. So I'm grateful for my association with the NAACP. And serving as the treasurer of the NAACP, I was around folks who were more seasoned, been around politics for quite some time. So when it came to going to the community where folks weren't necessarily familiar, were a community that were skeptical about a younger person seeking public office, wondering whether or not I could serve effectively, the folks in the NAACP, although it's a nonpartisan organization, they were able to vouch for me as a person, saying, hey, this is what he did with our organization. This is how effective he was. This is how responsive he was or is. In addition to that, something that's a little bit more closer to my heart is an organization called STS, which is a youth mentoring organization. And that was like essentially my joy, because I was around a lot of at-risk youth, and I'm growing up in a community that's majority minority community. There wasn't many younger people coming back. Everyone that I saw growing up that was speaking in the classrooms, that were going into the YMCAs or the community center, were like 40 years older than me. So for me, I wanted to make sure that I was in the community with young people. Probably like there's like a 10-year, 15-year gap, but it wasn't the 40, 50-year gap that I saw. But those were the organizations that were important for me. So when I did decide to seek public office, I was able to tap into the Shelby County Young Democrats for them to serve as my boots on the ground, my liaison in a community meeting when I couldn't go. When it came time to, because we all know that the majority of the voter are people older than us, older than me for sure. I was able to tap into the NAACP and say, hey, Mr. Doris, I'm really having a hard time with, sister so-and-so or this particular community organization. Look, I need you to go open the doors for me. And, that organization was able to open doors for me. But when it came time to say, okay, how can I show people that I can lead, but also, give guidance? Well, we talk about, STS, the youth mentor, the young kids. Imagine, you're on a campaign trail and you don't ask anyone to come speak on your behalf, and a 15-year-old person comes up and says, look, I can vouch for him. When I was doing X, Y, and Z, he got me together. There's nothing better than a young person vouching for you, and you're not telling them what to say. They're speaking from the heart. That moves people. So for me, it was all about, doing something that I was genuinely interested in, also having an opportunity to impact the lives of young people, but also learning. I'm sitting around the folks in the NAACP, give me guidance. I tell people I don't know it all, but I'm willing to listen and learn. But those organizations, made a world of difference in my race to serve half the city of Memphis.
And just a quick follow-up to that, there might be some folks on the call tonight that aren't as involved as they should be before they get ready to run. Do you have any advice for them about how to just start getting involved in the community?
Couple things. So I'll say it this way. Don't just join organizations just to join organizations so that you can have something to patch your resume, so to speak. Make sure it's worthwhile for you. When I mean worthwhile for me, making sure it's hard work, not just busy work, if that makes any sense. And if you're not necessarily involved in any organizations, that's okay. It's okay. Take your time, figure out what organization is it's best for you going forward, whether you like to be in the community centers, whether you are the basketball coach, whether you are, a part of the PTSA, which is a parent teacher student organization group. But you just don't have to join organizations, because I know, when I was running for city council, there were folks in the race with like 20 organizations. But what happened was, when it came time to, talk about the organization, they couldn't speak to anything because they really were a part of the organization on paper only. If you become a part of the organization, make sure you're doing everything that you can to learn and to make an impact. And that's what it's about. You don't need to be on thousands of organizations, but ones that matter to you, passion of yours, but also that you can make a tangible impact in whatever area it may be.
Thank you so much. Alicia, this next question is for you. So at Run for Something, we also suggest to interested candidates to select what office they want to run for based on the problems they've observed and the solutions that they think will help. How did that play out with your decision to run for Park Board?
It played out very naturally. As I mentioned when I shared a little bit about myself, I have two young sons, and we utilize our parks regularly, and that was an issue that was near and dear to my heart, and it was really personal. And it was personal in terms of my role in community as a community leader, and some would say community activist. So knowing that people were being shortchanged and a pandemic sort of shuttered the doors not only to our schools but to really many of the recreational and social opportunities that our young people were having. And so it was an easy, natural fit for me to find my way to the park board as an advocate and as a candidate, and then subsequently now as one of the commissioners citywide here. And so really simple. I know always it isn't really so clear and dry because there's so many issues that really tug at your heart and pull at like what feels extremely urgent, especially in times like we are in now. And what I really focused on, what would allow me to be able to still build with my family and not give up so much family time. And I can bring my children with me. Like my kids were out on the campaign trail. Some days they hated all the adult things, but everything that we did with young people, like at the parks, when we were visiting like release centers, they were excited about. And so that changes like where your importance is. For me, it was all about family and where can I be most successful with not giving up all of my time, in addition to the work that I'm doing here on the ground as an executive, but also my work with leading what transpires up at George Floyd Square here in Minneapolis. And so there was a lot of things going on. And so it's really important that I can utilize spending quality time with my boys, doing the things that they love, and being in parks, killing two birds with one stone. So that's how it really played out pretty well for me.
Awesome. And for a follow-up to that, you've mentioned a few times that during your campaign, you saw the park board as a place to address systematic issues such as food insecurity, homelessness, racial injustice, policing practices, and gun violence. So these are issues that folks wouldn't traditionally think of as part of the park board. Can you tell us about how that's been playing out since you've been in office and how you've been able to address those issues?
Yeah, certainly. So it plays out every day with the parkland, Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board being the largest landowner here in the city. What it plays out is that we have percentages of those crimes occurring on park property. And when we talk about crime and we talk about prevention and the recidivism rate, how do we address creating programs before these problems occur, in particular when we're talking about some of our young people and some of our families. So we look at it from a preventative perspective. If parks are offering engaging programs and the staff are connecting with young people, some of these things are not going to occur. And when you have accessibility to these spaces to recreate or to have a space to really just blow off some steam in a productive place, you're addressing some of these issues here. And Minneapolis, just like many other cities across this country, is seeing a large increase in homelessness. Well, when the parks are not busy with young people during the morning hours, why wouldn't it make sense to open our parks up for people to shower, utilize internet to get resources to address the issues that they're dealing with and bring those resources to the park, whether that's social services or other social service agencies like your county services or your state services, to be a resource. We don't have to be so adversarial and territorial to say, well, I don't want homeless people showering in the park at 8 in the morning because my kid's going to be there at 3 o'clock. Well, then by 3 o'clock, the park will be clean. And certainly these people are a part of our community. And so if we don't create a space where we all coexist, then it becomes contentious. And now we're fighting over territory. And so we're seeing that play out here in the city. And so really it's just about how do we get these parks open? How do we make sure that we're utilizing and maximizing the hours in which the buildings are open? And then how are we making sure the staff are properly supported? Because oftentimes you see we're not the only people dealing with these crises. It's not just people who maybe are unemployed who are struggling with food insecurity or access to a washer or dryer. It's paid staff that are working regular jobs too that have these gaps in their moments where they need food support, or maybe they just need to wash their clothes for work, or maybe they need a place to look for a better job. And so that's how we see it playing out. So we're really trying to be a stopgap in partnership with other city governmental agencies to bring those resources into like one hub and spread out over 100 locations across our city.
Thank you so much. So David, this next question is for you. You ran for one of 4 at-large Boston City Council seats. In the past, there have only been 2 Black men elected to this role, and you came very close in 5th place. You've mentioned to our team that you felt that Boston, there wasn't a strong infrastructure to help elect Black men to office. Can you tell us more about that experience and advice you'd have for other Black candidates in a similar situation?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it goes back to something that we talk about locally here and that many folks have probably heard who are on this call, which comes from a former member of Congress here in Massachusetts. All politics is local. So the advice that I give is very specific, of course, to Boston and our experience here in greater Boston, Massachusetts, but there are some commonalities that go across the board. As you mentioned, there have only been in history 2 Black men elected citywide in the city of Boston on the city council. There's never been a Black man or any Black person at all elected to the mayor's office. And in Boston, the way it works, we have 4 at-large seats. So citywide, we have 9 district seats. And that only got started back in the early 80s. And the reason for that was because Black people could not get on. That was the history, that was the reality on the ground. So moving and changing the structure from an all at-large body to having those district seats did increase Black representation, which was a good thing, but we still continued to see those persistent barriers. Unfortunately, what we've seen for Black men here in the city of Boston is that while many other groups have that kind of infrastructure around them, right? We have groups that help support women candidates, which is wonderful. And we've seen a really big swing in our pendulum politically here in terms of the representation of women, particularly women of color, particularly Black women, which has been wonderful. Our most recent, district attorney here in Boston, who's now our U.S. attorney, Rachel Rollins, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who many of you might have heard of, who was a former member of the city council running at large. It has been fantastic to see that. Unfortunately, what we also want to see is just more parity, because we know that when voices are left behind, whether intentionally or unintentionally, our conversations, our public discourse, our public dialogue are a little bit weaker. And to give you kind of a lay of the land of where we're at right now, in the city of Boston, when you go through every possible seat that somebody could sit in, so you're talking our city councilors, our state representatives, our Congress people, our statewide elected officials, every possible seat, there are only 3 Black men who are elected. Our sheriff here locally in Boston, 1 member of our House of Representatives, and 1 member of our city council, a district representative. And all 3 of them are doing good work, but they need to have more allies. And why is that so important? Because when we get to the place where we're making those conversations, and more importantly, making those policy decisions, very recently we had a very contentious conversation about police reform here in the Commonwealth. We need to have more voices, and we particularly need to have more voices that are living those experiences and are bringing that lived experience to the conversation. Understanding that the things that we're talking about when somebody gets pulled over, it might be different for you if you are white and from an affluent suburb than it is for so many of our friends and our neighbors here in our community, because the conversations that we have, the experiences and the history that we have are different, and they need to be incorporated into the policymaking process. And so that's why it, looks at, when we're looking at what is happening here in terms of those supports, they're so important to develop. And that is one of the things that not only I experienced, but once again, I said there were 17 people that were running in our city council at large race in this last cycle. In the final round, the top 8 finished. Of those, 10 were men of any race. Yeah, and 7 were women. And in the end result, there were only 2 men who made it through. So it's difficult. And I was the only man of color who made it through. So it's not just about Dave Halbert trying to move himself along, but it's about making sure that we're providing more opportunities, more pathways to get more representation, to have more people at the conversation. Because even if individuals don't make it onto whatever body or office it is, by having their voice continue through the conversation around our elections, we continue to elevate those discussions and making sure that we're putting the issues that are important to us and important to our communities and important to our survival front and center.
Thank you so much, David. So Alicia, as someone running for a down ballot race that may not get a lot of press attention, how did you approach fundraising? What does a campaign for Parks and Recreation Board really need money for?
I approach fundraising very simply, with the solution that the parks are critical for the problems plaguing our city. And many people understood that while most of the attention was on the mayoral race and our city council here, just given the height of where Minneapolis was following George Floyd and the lack of leadership there was there, certainly the parks were kind of like, oh yeah, yeah, I understand. I know what you're talking about. The great thing that I had going for me that helped people was that again, I'm on the ground and I'm leading in many different arenas, and so it was easy to remind people that while we will be simultaneously dealing with the racial reckoning that's happening in our city, as well as the policing issue, we will also have to address the fact that many of our young people and many of our seniors, this intergenerational gap that we were seeing was only growing wider, and how the parks could be a neutral place for that because it wasn't school and it wasn't church. And so it was just kind of a place where everybody could kind of come together and offering solutions for even some of our retired seniors and some of our families that are blended and non-traditional families to be able to have a place where they could all recreate and engage at one given time, while you can have, you know, maybe an aunt or uncle or grandma or mother over here learning knitting or basic computer skills. You could have young people in the gym learning basketball or outside engaging with soccer or learning music production or so on. And so reminding people of the other necessities that were happening and that needed to occur and the change that needed to occur in our city outside of the fact that we needed to elect, we were due up to elect a new mayor and an entire new city council. And so that was my approach, was to say, let's not get lost in hung up over here and believe that the only solution is in the leadership of our mayor or our city council, but also we have an obligation with our largest landholder to say, what are you doing to address the inequities and the disparities in our city? And how are you forward facing going to be a real solution and not just one that is on paper a solution, but create an environment where people truly feel welcome, where the programs truly are reflective and diverse according to the needs of each unique individual community here in Minneapolis.
Thank you so much, Alicia. David, this next question is for you. How did you connect with voters in Boston? In particular, what are some ways that you connected with the Black community? And also, how did you find ways to connect with other Boston communities in general?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for connecting with anybody, and I'm sure Alicia and JB would agree with this, is you just got to be authentic. You have to be yourself. Sometimes it's not going to rub everybody the right way, but you have to do it. Here in Boston, one of the things that we deal with is that I kind of talk about it in terms of packing and cracking, which we talk about in terms of redistricting often, but it's also true culturally. So in Boston, from the outside, people would pack everyone together and say, well, Black is Black is Black is Black. But there's a cracking that happens here as well, because we have an incredibly diverse Black community here in the city of Boston that represents a lot of different aspects of the Black diaspora. We have an incredibly vibrant Haitian community. We have vibrant English-speaking Caribbean community, an African community. And even within that, we have folks from East Africa, West Africa, and the like. So part of it is just understanding and respecting where people are coming from and really wanting to get to know them and understanding that and letting them know that you actually care about them and that you don't see them all as a monolith, because many of us have experienced that far too often. People just assuming that, all skin folk are kinfolk, and we know that's not the case. So you got to be honest about that when we're having these kind of conversations. But when we're talking about how do we expand it beyond it, in Boston, we have one of the higher percentages of any community in New England of Black population, but we're still not even the majority here, right? So if you're going to win, particularly if you're going to try to win citywide, you have to be able to build bridges. And once again, that comes back to being authentic. For me, a lot of that went towards my progressive values and my career and my focus on environmentalism and bringing that work in. And I found that that was something that you could blend both of those, because even if I was talking to somebody who somebody might say is, more of a hippie white person in Jamaica Plain, which is a little more left community here in Boston, I could talk to them about environmental issues, but talk to them about it in terms of environmental justice, talking about what it is to see communities that have been polluted, that have been disregarded, where we have too many buses going through and not enough trees being planted, and making that connection and letting them see the struggles that we have here in our communities, just blocks from my home, even though they don't live there, right? And making that conversation happen. When you get to that place where you can be authentic about the uniqueness of your, who you are, your complexion, your struggles, but also understanding what you can do to make sure that other people know that you share their values, that you share many of their kind of more universal concerns. That's how you can do it. That's how you build those bridges. That's how I was able personally to be successful in getting support from all across the city, and frankly, from corners where a lot of people didn't think that I would probably be able to get it. So I really appreciated that opportunity, but there's also struggles, which I won't take too much time about, but we can talk to about some of those groups that don't want to play ball with you based on certain issues as well. And that's very real as well. Those groups that don't give you that fair shake that you deserve. But like I said, we'll let that go for another couple of minutes.
I'll say, let me write that down because I want that to come back. I think that's very real. So we'll make sure we bring that back. JB, this next question's for you. So we've heard it from many candidates that running a campaign is a lot like starting a new business. In 2017, you started your own law firm. What are some of the lessons that you learned from starting a business that have been helpful in your campaign?
Ooh, that's a book. In all seriousness, they're almost identical. Identical in the sense that if you want to have a successful business, you have to invest time. There is sweat equity that you must put into it. There's resources. You have to figure out how to come up with the resources so that your business can sustain. And in addition to that, you're talking about resources, you talk about time, sweat equity. You also have to talk about, what is your plan? What is your business plan? And, when you talk about what is your business plan, time, resources, and sweat equity, all of those things are transferable when you're talking about a campaign, a budding campaign, especially if you're a grassroots candidate like I was. So let's think about, campaign. Time. Do you have enough time to seek public office? What's your time commitment? Are you going to be willing to knock doors from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or whatever time it gets dark in your particular area? Let's talk about resources. What are your resources? I'm not just talking about the money you're able to raise. I'm talking about the people you're able to call, the in-kind contributions you're able to get because you know who the sign printer is. And then also you talk about who are your friends? Who's going to answer the phone when you have a question? Like, I'm a lawyer. So when it was time I have a case that I need to prepare for, but it's an issue I haven't encountered before. Can I call a lawyer and say, let's talk through this? When you're running for office, it always helps if you can pick up the phone and call someone who's ran for office before, or call someone who currently serves in office. Like, how do you navigate this particular group who won't allow you in? Because David hit on it, and we can get back to that. Like, how do you navigate a particular group that won't allow you in just because you're a younger candidate, just because you don't have someone vouching for you? I think the two are almost interchangeable. And I talked about a business plan. What is your business model? How can your business sustain itself? When you're running for office, no matter how long your campaign is, whether you're running a 3 or 4 month campaign or whether your campaign is a year long, what is your campaign plan? How much money is it going to take for you to get from the beginning of the race to the end of the race? And what happens if your resources start running low? Do you have what it takes to sustain? Like, all of those things come into play when you're starting a business and when you're seeking public office. But for me, the ultimate question, no matter whether you're starting a business or whether you're seeking public office, because when resources run low, because they will, when your friends let you down, when that mentor or associate doesn't answer your calls, how much time are you willing to put in to make your business successful? How much time are you willing to put in to make your run for office as successful as you want it to be? And it always comes back to sweat equity. And one of my mentors would always ask me this before I decide to do something: how bad do you want it? How much are you willing to sacrifice so that you are in the position to put the community that you're seeking to represent in a better position?
Awesome. So I'm going to ask one more question to the panelists before we turn it over to the audience questions, since we got some good ones. So real quickly, if you could travel back in time, what piece of advice would you give yourself before you were starting to think about running for office? Alicia, how about you? I want the real truth. I'm going to catch you off guard.
If I could travel back in time, I would say do it sooner than where I got started. Between deciding and actually making it public much sooner, so that I can get to some of the people that I didn't get to build, some of the communities I didn't get to build the type of relationship I wanted. And now I'm doing that, but I would have liked to build it sooner with those folks, just to truly get to know their issues intimately and have a plan before I was sworn in for those communities, versus really being reactive right now to their needs. So when you can learn this stuff on a campaign trail, it makes your planning for when you actually get into office that much more successful. So then you can tackle the issues and know where you got to have some inroads, what back doors you got to go to, and who to push in the community that can come into a meeting and shake things up to say things that you may not be able to say, but you certainly can endorse as a elected official. So that would be my 2 cents.
Awesome. David, would you like to jump in on this?
Sure, really quickly. For me, I would have said to myself, quit that job earlier. To JB's point about putting in that time, I left my job in July to run full time, and that was a real decision between my wife and myself about our family. But if I could do it again, I would have left a couple months earlier, right? And just had a little bit more time to be out there, making those phone calls, being on the doors, doing a little bit more. You think it's always a guessing game when those things can and what you can sustain. And by the way, I know it's not really germane to the question, but I have to say, shout out to JB, because he was my run for something partner and mentor in that process. And he was an incredible resource, somebody that I could turn to when I had those kind of questions. So I really have always been deeply appreciative of that and for him taking that time out. But that's what I would have told myself, just leave that job a little bit earlier to get the job that you're really after.
Okay, JB, how about you?
2 things. Don't be scared. Ask for the money. And you can't be scared. So speaking of that, check out the chat. And then the second thing, for me, seriously, and what I mean by, I kind of touched on it earlier when I initially saw public office, I surrounded myself with nothing but millennials. But the truth of the matter is the community at large is more than millennials, more than my generation. It's an extremely diverse group. And I had to bring in people who looked at the world a little bit differently than me. Because in order to represent a people, you have to know the people. So when I saw public office the second time around, it was successful. If you look at my team, there were men, women, gay, straight, it didn't matter. It was a very inclusive group of people. We all sat down and we had brainstorming sessions about how can we develop a message that truly touches the people in the community. And we were successful. We unseated an incumbent who had 4 times more money than we did. And just inclusivity is really, really important.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So before we open up the questions, we're going to launch a quick poll. So everyone's going to see a poll launch on their screen. This is if you're interested in taking the next steps with Run for Something. So if you're interested in talking about your plans, to run for office, brainstorming next step, please opt in for a call with a Run for Something volunteer. If you're running for office in 2022 and apply for endorsement, this volunteer call will also serve as an endorsement interview. If you're still thinking about running, this will just help you continue to think about stuff. So if you opt in, a volunteer will reach out to you. I see a lot of folks answering. I'm going to leave this open for like a few more seconds so we can go ahead and jump into our first question. Okay. Awesome. All right, cool. I see most of y'all have answered, so I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll. So the first question, thank you for hanging on to the person who asked this question. I want to make sure that we get this in. How do you navigate around a political structure? This person is in Detroit, but I think this is true for a lot of different places where you're young and you're qualified, but you are told to wait your turn. Oh, JB,
You don't. I just don't buy into wait your turn politics. I think a lot of the discrepancies or the inequities that we see in our community is because of wait your turn politics. Folks hold elected office for 20, 30 years and they get complacent and they stop doing the work. I think the same fire that gets you motivated to seek public office, the same fire that gets you to join that particular community group is the same fire that will cause you to create substantive change in your communities. And this is how you navigate around it. You put your message up against the incumbent who's sitting there not doing anything. And you let the people decide. And I think that's what makes our democracy good. The people at the end of the day get to decide who goes into that particular office. I talked about, so when I moved back home 6 months and I saw public office because I just felt like the community deserves someone who's going to push for change. And everywhere I went, it was wait your turn. He's not ready yet. He's too young. And you're going to hear that no matter what you do. You can wait 10 years. There's a particular candidate who's seeking office here in Shelby County, and she's 65. And her entire life, she was told to wait your turn. Your turn will come. And now she's 65 seeking office for the first time. I just don't buy into it. You run, you let the people decide, let the gatekeepers, everyone who's telling you to wait your turn, let them campaign against you. Because the truth of the matter is, and I truly believe this, your message would be the message that resonates in the community, but you have to believe that. And you have to convince everyone that you have an opportunity to speak in front of, that the message that you're bringing to your community is the message that's about changing and about pushing back against the status quo. And I think that's what our communities need. So when you hear somebody wait your turn, they're scared to change. They're scared about the change that you will bring, the much needed change. Run.
David, do you want to jump in on that at all?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, make sure you have friends. And by that, I mean, if you can be out there being that leader that JB was talking about, that is fantastic. But if you can also be that leader while encouraging and lifting up other leaders who can do it, that's even better, right? When you have multiple people that are running for offices, that are feeding into one another, that are providing energy to each other's campaigns and their messages because you're of accord, because you're of like mind, it just increases the odds that one or all of you will be successful. We saw that example 4 years ago. Ayanna Pressley was running as a city councilor against a longtime incumbent member of Congress, but also we had a contested district attorney's race where we had a unknown candidate in Rachel Rollins who was running, and we had 2 state representatives who were running. The one was running against the sitting Ways and Means chair, and the other was running for an open seat. All 4 women of color, and I can tell you, I was on the ground. We saw people. You talking anybody who was around here at that time? There was an energy. If you were going to vote for Ayanna, you were probably voting for Rachel. If you were going to vote for Rachel and you were in one of those districts, you might have been voting for Nika or Liz, and they were going into that feedback loop. And it wasn't because they were running necessarily a coordinated campaign, but it was because when somebody got to the polls and they looked at that ballot, they said it wasn't just this one person who shared their views and their values, but it was this team of people that were pushing ahead. So the more you can do to find and encourage other leaders to support other leaders, the better I think you're going to be in terms of moving the agenda forward.
Awesome, thanks. So this is a very practical question that we have from the chat. How far in advance to the election did you launch your campaign, or did you start doing all the stuff you need to do. JB, any thoughts?
I was thinking, so completely different depending on the race you're running for. As it relates to my governor's race, we announced over a year in advance because you have to travel the entire state. You want to talk to communities that you're not familiar with, and that requires a lot of time. But in the district race, I think we announced the election was in October. I announced in February. Matter of fact, Run for Something was my announcement essentially. I don't even know if I was prepared for it. I just looked up. Oh, they announced their endorsement today. I guess I would tell the folks in my district. I plan on seeking city council. So announced in February. The election was in October. But you want to give yourself enough time because for here, and I think in a lot of different other places, there's a lot of yard signs. There's a lot of signs, and if you wait too long, it will be clutter. For me, it was about being out early and often, and being essentially the only candidate out as long as possible. Yielded the best results.
So I just want to acknowledge that Alicia had to jump off the call. She had an emergency at her office. She does have her information in the chat. So if there's anyone on the call that would like to keep in touch with Alicia, her email is there. So make sure you get that. We'll drop that again before the end of the call. But thank you so much for answering that question, JB. So we had two questions that are kind of similar. One person has asked about how do you deal with attack ads, and another person asked about how do you deal with an incumbent or opponent that you're running against doing some nasty stuff, intercepting files, you name it. I know here in Chicago, I know a candidate bought somebody's name as their web domain and made a fake site. So you have it. So how do y'all deal with that kind of stuff? David?
Sure. I benefit from the fact that we didn't really have attack ads because you're running at large in Boston for one of 4 seats. It's not like you're running head to head against people. So it kind of encourages people to play a little bit nicer. But I will say, while the candidates and sometimes even the campaigns are doing good, that next step out, that's where you can get into, some shenanigans, as we call it around here. Right, where you'll have organizations that will, for example, endorse multiple candidates, but not do equivalent work for those candidates. And far too often, frankly, it is candidates of color who often find themselves on the losing end of that. I will tell you a personal example was we were out on preliminary day. So we have a preliminary election and the general election. We were out at a heavy duty polling location, and my campaign manager and I rolled up, and we saw individuals who were with a local union that had endorsed us, holding signs for one of the people running in my race, holding signs for another person that was running for my race, and not one of our signs anywhere to be seen. Right. And we had some conversations with them, and they did a little bit better for the general, but still, being honest, not equivalent. And so it's how do you navigate that, both in terms of having those kind of conversations that can be really tough, particularly when it's groups that are ostensibly saying that they're supporting you, but they're not really doing it in an equitable fashion, but also making sure that you're passing that knowledge and that information along to the next person who comes along, whether you win or lose, to say, look, if you're dealing with this group, you're dealing with this individual, these are the things you need to know. It's not, once again, it's not just about you getting in office. It's about hopefully you opening the door and doing everything you can to pull other people up behind you, and passing that information, particularly for our communities, is one of the most important ways that you can do that.
Awesome. So we have another question that I think maybe both of you all could speak to. This person is in a heavily Democratic state and they'd like to run, or even I think this could apply to a heavily Democratic district. A lot of Black folks are in very blue areas, especially urban areas. Do you have any advice for folks and how to really, I'm thinking of you, David, since you were in such a crowded field, but even you, JB, if you have any advice for how to deal with being in a place where there's a lot of Democrats and they all want to run and there's one office.
So for me, I guess the ultimate question is, is it a nonpartisan race, or is it a race where there is a primary? I mean, those are the things that you have to take into consideration. But generally speaking, what you have to ask yourself is, what's your natural base? I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I know if I get into the church, I would have an opportunity to speak, I would do well. So you out there always have to consider, what's your natural base, viability of your campaign, and and I go back to the very same question, because a lot of these district races, it's about time commitment. How hard are you willing to work? How much time that you're willing to put in? Because when you talk about a crowded race, my very first race, my race for city council, I speak on that. There were 6 candidates. One candidate had 4 times more than we had, and we probably raised about the third amount in terms of funding. We were the third highest in terms of funding, but there was no one in the race who knocked more doors. There was no one in the race who spent as much time in the community as I was spending in the community. So for me, it wasn't about how many people was running. It was all about our campaign, what we were doing to get our message out. How many people, how many hands did I shake? How many push cards did I pass out? How many campaign material did we leave on a particular card? What restaurant did I visit? How many people did we speak to? So I don't necessarily spend so much time focusing on how many people running. For me, I focus on what we're doing and how effective we are at letting people know what our particular message is. So for you, whoever asked the question, I can't really see it. Don't spend so much time focused on, how many people are seeking a particular office. You determine what's your base and how much time that you have to commit to this particular race, and go out there, knock doors, shake, well, in the pre-COVID area, hopefully get post-COVID at some point, shake some hands. So don't focus on it, and just run your race. Run your race.
Yeah, the only thing I would add really quickly to that is I think that it also depends on what kind of race you're running, right? Mine was kind of unique because it isn't a one-on-one kind of a thing where you're going from one seat. There are multiple seats. So it was a little bit different. But the other thing is understanding, while you want to focus on your own race, absolutely, and I agree with JB 100% on that, you do want to be aware of what those other people are, not because of how it's going to affect how you're working in some ways, but it does affect your understanding of what the numbers are, right? And who's out there. Because, for example, if you represent one particular viewpoint or community and you have one opponent, 2 opponents, 3 opponents, but there's a group, there's a constituency, there's an issue that doesn't really have a champion there, those are people you can get, right? If you can identify it and you can get out there and get after it, right? If there's a strong environmentalist community, but nobody's talking about climate change, nobody's really talking about, urban environmental issues, if you're running in a city or something like that, that's an area where you can go, just as an example. So being aware of the full lay of the land, so you know what the issues are and who's out there, who you can talk to, who you might still be able to pull out of that undecided camp and into yours, can be really important.
Thank you so much. So we have a question about how to decide whether, if you're, this person has a lot of interest. This is actually Danielle who's asking this question. And they're not really sure what level they want to start off in running. How does one decide whether they should run something a little bit more locally or a little bit smaller, or maybe a higher office? And and they also asked, what are some things that make you different from others, and how did you showcase that in your campaign to set yourself apart from folks?
Well, I start off. For me, it's about what you're passionate about. For me, if you saw me about 3 years ago when I first got into politics, I spent 85% of my time talking about a particular zip code, 38126. And I stated previously, it was the poorest zip code in the state of Tennessee, how people in that community had a life expectancy of 13 years fewer than the predominantly white communities. And the fact that the individual who was representing that district, one of the individuals representing that district, been in office 25 years. We didn't talk about, there was no conversation about divestment in the community. There was no conversation about the health disparities. There was no real conversation about what it looked like to lift this community up. So I spent the entire time talking about that particular issue. So for me, I was trying to figure out how could I best serve this particular community? And for me, it was everything, because My mom grew up in a community. I have family in a community. I spent the summers of my childhood in a community. So I spent every moment of my time talking about this particular community, and how you distinguish yourself from people. And I guess this goes to one of David's points earlier. He talked about knowing what everyone else is doing. And you pay attention, but how I distinguish. So right now, when I'm seeking the office of governor in the state of Tennessee, there's no other candidate that has experience on local government. There's no other candidate that has experience in the courtroom when decisions are being made. There's no other candidate that can sit down at the table and understanding the disparate impact laws could have on particular communities. Just use your background. And the truth of the matter is there's no other candidate like you. Truthfully, there's no candidate like you. What you have to do, and when I spend time with some folks on my campaign team, you go through your life experiences and you illuminate the things that will connect with people. There's something in your life that makes you different than everyone else. And you are to use that every chance you get, because, I think, I'm not sure who said it earlier, but the most important thing is speaking from your heart. There's a speech that I gave, folks in Tennessee talk about it, the 3-star speech. The candidates is the big Democratic speech. Candidates get up there reading their notes, and I just walked on the stage and I looked at the crowd and I had a conversation with people, and people talk about it to this day. And it's because I wasn't reading any notes. I just really knew the issues that were important to me, and I talked from the heart. And what I would suggest to you is understand your story. Be willing to tell your story. You talk from the heart, because you may stumble, but it will connect with people. And that's the most important thing, figuring out ways to connect with people and move people.
Awesome. So David, this next question is actually for you. How do you address important issues in your community? How do you address important issues to your community in a minority community where the majority might not understand the important issue that you're raising?
Yeah,
this is
absolutely.
From Ian.
Thank you for the question, Ian. No, it is a really important question, right? Because oftentimes we have to translate what it is we are experiencing, what our communities are experiencing, to people who may not share that on a day-to-day, regardless of what the issue is. I think one of the most important things you can do is, one, try to find that sense of commonality. So one of the things that I used to talk about when I was on the doors or when I was at events was the fact that at the end of the day, housing is the #1 issue here in Boston, right? We are in a housing crisis and have been for some time. And that the issues that are pushing people out, the forces that are pushing people out here in my neighborhood, my section of Dorchester, which is predominantly Black, aren't actually that different than they are in South Boston, which, if you know anything about the history of Boston, it was where busing really happened. And all those pictures you saw from the 70s of people throwing rocks at buses full of Black kids trying to go to a high school and get an education. And so people would think those are worlds apart, but there's people in that community who are getting pushed out in just the same way. So first, it's finding that commonality, finding that common touch, that common tone, and getting you to a place where people understand that you're hearing them, that you're trying to hear what it is that they're saying, that you respect what it is that they're saying, and that you care ultimately. That's what this job is about. People want to know, yes, they want to know that you know what you're talking about, that you have ideas, but ultimately they want to know that you actually care about them and that you want to actually help them and improve their lives. So when you're talking about those issues, regardless of what it is, there is a way to show that. There is a way to connect one community to another. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult, right? When we're talking about police reform, and I'm talking about it here because I have neighbors who have been accosted by police. I have people who, if you go back in the history books here in Boston, can still talk about the Charles Stewart case, where there was a whole neighborhood of Black and brown young men who got run through because somebody said that a pregnant white woman got killed by a Black man when it was actually her white husband that committed the murder. And they're still dealing with the psychological and the emotional trauma of that. That's very different than if I go down the road to a neighborhood that is all cops. But we're talking about it, and we have to be honest about what it is we're talking about, because that's the biggest thing that voters, no matter what part of the country you're in, no matter what race you're running for, will tell you. They can smell fake a mile away, right? And so you have to be honest and authentic about it. And you have to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, especially as a person of color running. right? Because there's so many of the things that we need to do, so many of the advances that we need to make, that will not happen if we're simply trying to make people consistently feel easy and comfortable. People do need to have their assumptions and the way that they're approaching things be challenged. That's the only way you're going to make progress, but you have to do it in a way that balances that out with respect.
So we've heard some really great advice from both of you all tonight. Thank you so much. I just want to wrap the call up with one final question. Speaking of all the good advices you've gotten, what's the best advice you've received about running for office? Or if you'd like to share the worst advice, it's up to you all. Yeah, I'm sure y'all have heard some crazy stuff. Whoever would like to go first.
Say, JP, what's the worst advice you gave me? No, I'm just kidding.
A lot. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'll say that the best advice that I got really was from some of the folks that I had the privilege of working for, who told me that just the experience of being able to run is a privilege, particularly as a person of color, particularly as a Black person in this country, because there's a lot of people who made a lot of sacrifices and fought a lot of fights so that people like JB and Alicia and myself could even have that opportunity to be there, right? That never even got that chance. And so you want to be present in the moment. You want to appreciate everything that you're getting to do, and you want to make sure that you're always doing it for the right reasons, that it's not about you, but it is about we. It is about us as a community. It is about us as a culture. It is about us as a society, and about uplifting and paying it forward and paying back all those people and all the sacrifices that they made. And so that's something that really sits with me, that lives in my heart and in my soul when I think about what public service truly is, beyond even elected office, right? And I think that that's something that I would want to impart to anybody who I was talking about why you're running for office, or if you're considering running for office.
Ditto. The worst advice that I received was, let's see, how do we say, I had to be someone other than myself. I think when I first started running, I was told that I couldn't wear jeans. I must wear suits every single day, and it wasn't authentic. It wasn't JB Smiley. It was the person that folks in my camp wanted me to be, and I think people saw right through it, because I was uncomfortable. I was talking about issues that really were not a passion of mine, and it was just awkward. I'm not the candidate that would go there just reading this long speech, because I couldn't connect. And I don't do that as a lawyer. I don't know why I attempted to do that as a candidate. And what I quickly realized is I was able to connect with people when I went back to who I am naturally, which is someone who usually is off the cuff, someone who speaks from the heart, someone who knows the issues that I'm passionate about. I'm going to talk about those issues every chance I get. And I would say the best advice that I received was from a 84-year-old former president of our school board. And he said, well, Smiley Jr., I'm a junior, he said, you probably should go to Sting's restaurant and just sit with the people. What he meant by that was, go be among the people. Figure out what issues that were pressing for the community that I was seeking to represent. And this is essentially how I ended up with an extremely diverse campaign team. Listening to people who talked about the issues in their community. I may not agree with all the issues, but the role of an elected official is to represent the people that he or she is seeking to represent. And I can't represent those people if I'm unwilling or afraid to walk the streets of the community or eat in the restaurants in which they frequent. So understanding that I have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, I had to listen so that I can better understand the community.
Well, thank you both so much. Before we go tonight, I again just want to thank the panelists this evening for sharing your experience and wisdom with us tonight. I heard a lot of great things. I hope folks took note of what was going on in the chat. I hope some people wrote some things down. And we want to thank everyone who participated and asked questions. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Everyone on the call will be getting an email from us tomorrow with resources from Run for Something to use as you prepare to run for office. And if you opted in to speak with a volunteer, look for an email in the next few weeks to find a time to schedule a call to talk about your plans. We need you and we're here to support you. Thank you again, and everyone have a great night.